Hello, and welcome to this Lenten video series. I'm Melissa Lemons, co-pastor of Unity Church in Wilmington, Delaware, assistant professor of clinical mental health counseling at Wilmington University, and a member of the Delaware-Maryland Synod's Racial Justice Ministry team. Our team invites you and your communities to engage in a dialogue about the biblical passages assigned for this Lenten season. We have asked clergy and lay leaders to reflect on the text through the lens of their personal experience and womanist theology. Womanist theology is a form of liberation theology that encourages every person to view the connections between faith and their life experiences in their unique configuration of sexuality, gender, race, and social class. While originally grounded in the diverse experiences of Black women, womanist theology leaves no one outside of God's saving grace and denies no one their personhood. As Reverend Dr. Wilda Gaffney expressed it, womanist theology invites everyone to the table. Whether you agree or disagree, share common meanings, or come from different cultures, all are welcome to the table. Womanist theology invites us to listen for the voices and interpretations of those who may be overlooked or downplayed in the biblical text. As you will discover over the course of this 5-part series, all too often, the voice that's overlooked in the biblical stories is the voice of God. You, child of God, whoever you are and whatever identities you embody, are invited to listen, think, grow, imagine, and engage others in the exploration of God's vision for human health and wholeness. Join us as we imagine and reimagine what these ancient texts are calling us into today. Today, we join our speaker, the Reverend Tamika Young-Savage, at First Evangelical Lutheran Church in Ellicott City, Maryland, where she is associate pastor. Our final video is titled, God Says Forgiven, and we ask, really? Reverend Young-Savage will discuss the 31st chapter of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a priest called to be a prophet to Jerusalem at the end of the kingdom of Judah, almost 600 years before Jesus. The people sinned, worshiping other gods, sacrificing children, and mistreating the most vulnerable among them, including widows, orphans, and immigrants. Israel didn't listen to Jeremiah's warning to repent, so Babylon defeated them and took them into exile. God asked Jeremiah to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. And Reverend Young-Savage helps us to understand what that work means for us.
Hear the words of the prophet Jeremiah. The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. It won't be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. They broke that covenant with me, even though I was their husband, declares the Lord. No, this is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my instructions within them and engrave them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. They will no longer need to teach each other to say, "Know the Lord," because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wrongdoing and never again remember their sins. We join the ancient people of Israel and Judah in hearing the words of the prophet Jeremiah in what biblical scholars call the Little Book of Consolation, or Jeremiah's Book of Comfort. This particular portion is contained in chapters 30 through 33 And it is here that a desolate and traumatized people are given a hopeful message and perspective of God's reversal and renewal for them, which is in contrast to the harsh judgment we can hear in what comes before it, chapter 1 through 29, and after it, chapter 34 through 54. For example, in chapter 3, Jeremiah likens God's people to that of a promiscuous woman, or as he calls her, a whore. He starts off this chapter by asking whether a man would be willing to take back a woman he has divorced, and especially so if she has decided to be with another man. His, Jeremiah's, description of the situation and analogy of God in a marital relationship as a jealous husband speaks to the cultural and limited patriarchal understanding of the prophet's time and is often echoed even now in ours. The Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, a womanist Hebrew biblical scholar, teacher, and author, took the prophet and his words from chapter 3 to task in a sermon she entitled, "The Forehead of a Whore." She exposes the realities of rape culture that was reflected in the prophet's words and speaks truth to power for women who have found themselves victims of abuse of any kind and/or are called out of their name. And I want to offer that Dr. Gaffney's words of redemption in her sermon, in contrast to Jeremiah's, echoes a similar ring of truth of who God is revealed to be in Jeremiah 31. And I bring up Jeremiah's words in chapter 3 so that we keep the harmful and problematic heteronormative rhetoric at the forefront of our minds when we hear words of God being the husband, as we do in verse 32. As Dr. Gaffney put it, Jeremiah's analogy doesn't hold water with me because it doesn't speak to God's promises, commitments, or covenants. God has never divorced or abandoned God's people, but God's people have been hurt on God's watch. Israel and Judah fell. Their people were enslaved by one regime after another, defeated, deported, disbanded, and diasporized. Their daughters subject to all the violence Jeremiah uses in his sermon. We too, as Black women, have been harmed. Our people were subject to the same depredations. And with this in mind, we can see how this hopeful message in chapter 31 of reversal and renewal might have empowered this generation of people who had lost so much. Not only was God offering something new to them, a new covenant, God was offering a freedom in the merciful, gracious gift of forgiveness and forgetting, in a way that would counter any harmful rhetoric that Jeremiah had proclaimed in the rest of his sermon. It is here, in this new covenant, that God seems to offer not only restoration, but offer something beyond the confines of their time, and can lead one to see the possibilities of a liberation that God so often does for her people in their time of distress and need. The possibilities of liberation that colors a picture of a more just and egalitarian society, where forgiveness and release from guilt and shame can propel them and us to imagine something more, not only for our time, but for the future to come. In chapter 32, God first reminds the people of the depths of her love for them, that before the covenantal relationship with their ancestors, likened to that of a faithful spouse, she went to great lengths to free them, to take them out of enslavement and to give them a new way to be with her and with one another. She not only wanted to free them physically, but mentally as well. But sometimes, freedom is hard to grasp, especially when for so long you have lived in fear of those who held you captive. We can read in the Exodus stories how many times the people spoke out of frustration because it was a hard road to freedom. Nothing was easy, from the travel through the wilderness to the lack of food. Each time God would provide, but it still wasn't easy. We hear this same sentiment often in the voices of Black people who have endured over 400 years of enslavement, segregation, Jim Crow laws, inhumane treatment, and injustice in this country. So God does a new thing for this new generation of people who have found themselves once more wandering in the wilderness and seeking out God's protection and liberation. God offers us what many of our Black mothers, church mothers, godmothers, grandmothers, aunties have offered in hard times. She offers her instructions and strength to survive. She offers wisdom to her people that not only helped their ancestors survive, but also cultivated the imaginations of each person to a life of freedom for all. This is how I hear the words in verse 33. What is engraved in the hearts of God's people is something more permanent than what was destroyed on scrolls and written documents. It's a sense of belonging to one another and to God, no matter what one's status in society may be. In some commentaries, I've read that while verses 33 and 34 do not speak in the same way to individualism in the ways we understand it in our Western society today, it does speak to the individual consciousness to know God. And while I think there is truth to that assessment, it's quite hard to separate the understanding that it also speaks to the collective memory of a people who have endured so much, and how God continues to enliven and empower each generation to a new way of freedom, a new way of liberation. It reminds me of the strands of hope that continues to regenerate with each new generation of Black people in this country. How no matter how white supremacy and racism tries to oppress us, there seems to be a new strand of consciousness that harkens back to the work of those who fought for freedom in our past, but that is also new and evolutionary in a way that brings us closer to a glimpse of what God's freedom really looks like. And the forgiveness and forgetting in Jeremiah 31, well, that's freedom. As people of God, Jeremiah 31 calls us to remember that God is merciful and forgiving in all times. But oftentimes, shame and guilt can come with its own cages of bondage and enslavement. Often people who have endured much can internalize the painful realities of their lives, the painful and harmful rhetoric of those who dehumanize and cause harm, can become infused in the psyche of those who are the target. And God's new covenant was not only to engrave her wisdom and means of survival on the hearts of her people, but was to truly set them free from the internal bondage of shame and guilt. While Jeremiah wanted to shame the people into obedience, God shows mercy in forgetting any wrongdoing and showing that liberation was truly possible in all aspects of one's life. What then does this mean for you? How have you found yourself in bondage to shame or guilt, or even what others have placed on you that wasn't even yours? What has been engraved on your heart? When you hear of God's forgiveness and love, do you believe it to be true? Or is there a part of you that hears judgment instead?
Reverend Jancewicz, thank you for that message. And thank you for speaking terms that our church needs to grapple with. Heteronormative rhetoric, limited patriarchal understanding, rape culture, abuse. I can imagine that any one of those words or phrases would shut down conversation in most congregations. And I'm glad that you spoke them so that we have an opportunity to consider them as church. We'll all have our own conversations, of course, but I'm curious about what you hope would come from a conversation, for example, about heteronormative rhetoric.
Yeah, I hope that people are willing to be open to how much the church has maybe missed the opportunity to have open conversations, not just about like heteronormative things, but just relationships in general, right? And how we've boxed in what relationships look like by sticking to these very strict lines, right? And I have to give credit though to Dr. Gaffney for her sermon, because initially when I was reading the scripture, I just was really like excited about the hope in it. But I went back to read a little bit more about the prophet and the writing, and her sermon came up, and I was like, oh, well, that's problematic, right? And then it made it easier then to dig deeper into what is being said there, right? And why is God being likened to a husband in a relationship where in some ways it's like the wife was unfaithful, right? And so why is that the analogy that we accept as the only way to see the church in relationship with God, when now we have so many different expressions of relationships, right? So, yeah.
You mentioned the gracious gift of God's forgiveness and forgiving. And I know it's going to be hard to pin down, but where do you think our church or any church can grow if we can forgive and forget some things?
So I'm wondering though, I don't necessarily think that the church needs to forget. Maybe the church should ask for forgiveness. But I do see the power in being open to God's forgiveness and God forgetting those things. Because there are so many people who have been harmed by the church. And that's most churches, and so having those conversations of where we can ask for forgiveness, right? And where we hope that God is not holding on to those things, the harm that we did, we really hope, that God has forgiven us as well as is not holding it against us, right? So I think that's more of where I hope people will go with that conversation, and the freedom that you get from accepting God's forgiveness, the freedom to see the church in a new way, right? And the freedom to see how other people are free and who they are, right? And beyond this idea that people need to be forgiven for that, because I think that was usually the rhetoric, right? Like you need to ask God to forgive you for being who you are. And I think that's not what that is, right? But instead, the church seeking forgiveness for those things, for saying those kind of things, and also acknowledging who people fully are, right? And embracing it and seeing that as an addition, a beautiful addition, not just an addition, but like God in working in the church, right? When people are willing to come back or even step into spaces that caused harm, and say, well, actually, I still love God and I know God and this is who I am. And for us to see that as a gift of God, right? That people are willing to still embrace that relationship with God and share it with us as a church. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to continue that thought with the idea that you mentioned that God's liberation extends beyond our bodies to our mentalities, right? And it seems like sometimes we have been in exile with COVID-19, with white supremacy causing violence in the streets and in our politics.
Yeah.
Where are some places you can imagine that our mentality as church needs to be liberated?
It's a really good question. I think we've been challenged during this time about what we have considered to be normal and what we have considered to be worship, and how that looks. And I can't, maybe it's different for every person, like every institution, but it seems as though many of us have had to rethink and reimagine what church can be like when we can't meet each other face to face, when we can't do certain parts of our rituals that we are used to, we can't sing. You know, there's just so many things that are different now. And so we had to be open to the Holy Spirit's direction. And hopefully some of us were open to being more imaginative as to how God shows up in those spaces. So yeah, I think and while that feels restricting, and in some ways there's understandable grief for losing that part of us, right? I hope there's also a sense of grace in it, giving us the opportunity to do things maybe slightly different, to see how God is still showing up in spite of all these things that we have been very accustomed to not happening. Yeah, so I hope, did that answer?
I think so.
Good.
I think so.
All right.
And then I guess finally the big message of your talking of that passage was sort of, where are you seeing strands of hope?
You know, I see hope when I think of the many people who have come to see and be awakened to the injustices in our world. It feels like it's about time sometimes, right? But I also, for me, it's a reminder that no one is incapable of changing, that no one is incapable of actually understanding and awakening to the truth. Even the hardest people, right? And I just remember after George Floyd had died, how many people started to speak more about this injustice. And while it may feel like that was just like a moment in time, I believe that that what I mentioned about like a new strand of consciousness, I believe that awakening can really shake us and move us past, right, those like where we are. And so I see hope in that. It doesn't mean that it will change tomorrow, but it does mean that it can change, that we can change, right? So I see hope in that. And I also see a lot of hope in our younger generations who are a lot less tolerant of injustice and harm being done to people, and just do not understand how we do not get it. Like, you know, I speak to my kids and I'm like, they just don't understand sometimes. Like, why is this even a thing, you know? And while that doesn't mean that eradicates the injustices, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia that still exists, right? What it means to me is that with each new way of thinking, we can evolve and change that. Like, it's just that change that I think is hopeful. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you. We hope that you will continue this discussion.